theory has to have a priority.
Capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing.
The dimension of the future has disappeared.
There is actually no representation anymore.
There is no final resolution to contradiction.
Militant proletarian snake handling over abysses never gets much wilder than this.
All right, everybody, welcome back to The Dangerous Maybe. And today we are joined by the one and only Helen Rollins. We are going to have a conversation about her book, Psychocinema, and some basic Lacanian concepts that she uses and explores in the book. But before we get started, Nance, what's up with you?
I'm chilling, man. This book, when it came out, I was talking with a buddy, Will, shout out Will. And he was like, man, this book is excellent. I love this book. And I was like, okay. And it was like initially when we were talking about it, Will's a film guy. He makes film. He appreciates film. I'm not. I'm a heathen. I like skateboards and shiny objects. So I felt intimidated getting into film, and also analysis. I'm also a poor dummy who doesn't know anything about analysis either. But initially talking about it with him kind of gave me a little bit of insight into it, but going back over it again a few months later, and kind of getting ready to talk about it, I found a lot more in it that kind of clicked at a level for me. And there were some things that you dealt with that put me at ease, like the way you deal with sex and sexuation. I really appreciated. A lot of the time I find a lot of Lacanians just kind of go on and on and on and on and on, and it gets very disinteresting. But the way you dealt with it here, I feel like for me was very apt, very to the point, and made it make a little more sense. So I really appreciate that, among other things as well.
Thank you.
So yeah, thanks for being here, Helen. We've been wanting to talk about your book for a long time. Before we get into the book, though, there's some exciting news that I want you to tell the audience about. What's going on next month at Philosophy Portal?
Yeah, so next month we're doing so my husband and I run this like small pamphlet house called Everyday Analysis. We publish short books. It was once a month. It sort of petered out a little bit, but we regularly publish small pamphlets and give lectures and things like this. And we're doing a collaboration with Cadell at Philosophy Portal. And it's basically just the standard psychoanalysis and subjectivity and capitalism, basically. So looking at how an understanding of the structure of subjectivity and desire might help us understand capitalism better and negotiate it better. It also looks at what subjective positions capitalism puts us into. And my husband's got a few more theories on that than me. But yeah, we're sort of team teaching it. And I think it runs the whole of November.
So anybody who's watching that's currently taking my month at the portal with Cadell, if you're interested, you've seen, we've talked about artificial intelligence and how it relates to subjectivity. If you want to keep learning about this thing, about the friction between capital and subjectivity, take Helen and Alfie's course next month. It'll be, I think both of our months in the portal are actually really compatible conceptually. So I was really excited to see that you guys were teaching the month after I get done. So awesome. So okay, I have wanted to talk to you about your book for so long. Why don't you give the audience just a brief introduction? The book's called Psychocinema. So what does that mean, and why should we approach viewing cinema through psychoanalysis?
Sure. So I wrote this book. It's funny because it's a couple of years ago now, by the time it all gets sort of published, all this kind of stuff. And the reason why it's about film is because my main job is a filmmaker. So it's through that lens, but it really is not necessarily about film. It uses film as sort of like a test case example of how we can understand psychoanalytic ideas operating in our world. And one of the things, actually, I mean, I got drawn to a lot of these ideas in Lacan through being taught Lacanese via film studies. I did a sort of literature degree and got a little bit in my undergrad and was interested enough that I kind of did an independent study, and I then sort of felt like what was being taught in mainstream film education was incorrect. And then sort of on the more practical level of making films, seeing how these ideas have really affected materially how films are made and read and understood. So I kind of wanted to do a little corrective on that in terms of the film study understanding of Lacan. But overall, the main sort of thrust of it is that it's not so interesting to read films in this sort of faux psychoanalytic detective sense. What was going on in the filmmaker's head? What is the hidden meaning? Because as we know, this is sort of a part of the sort of decoy of how psychoanalysis really works, which is sort of the opposite of this. So instead of leading us to be ideological thinkers looking for a hidden meaning, we look to the surface of what is actually there that we don't see, that is in fact manifest. And I basically argue, yeah, that it's less interesting to analyze films for its hidden meaning, for their hidden meaning, but to look at film as a technology that's sort of analogous to the process of psychoanalysis itself. So film as psychoanalysis. So it's film as philosophy and then film as psychoanalysis. And I think it's not just film, but psychoanalysis, this sort of transference, counter-transference, and exposing certain aspects of subjectivity is at play all the time in society outside of the logic of capital. And I kind of argue for obviously it's quite difficult because capitalism is a logic that sort of expands. So it's always sort of colonizing, for want of a better word, spaces where it might be possible to do a logic that's antithetical to that. But that film in its traditional sense, so a lot of people have a sort of denigration for the old American style of storytelling. And I actually say that perhaps this is the most emancipatory form if it's sort of performed and understood in a certain way. Yeah, but mostly, yes, the key idea is this idea that film could be understood as psychoanalysis itself.
See, I find it really interesting, right? Because throughout the book, you're talking about how film can provide us with these moments of reckoning with our own lack, having an encounter with our constitutive lack. And it's interesting because so many films seem to give us phantasmatic scenarios of how we can, end on the happy ending, or the phantasmatic closure. Oh, things are going to be, the Jerry Maguire ending,
Yeah.
But I love these examples that you have of getting at cinema, I think at a more fundamental level, where sure, the phantasmatic image can be used ideologically, but cinema as an art form detached from capital actually is geared towards these moments of confronting us with our own intrinsic contradictory desires and fantasies. And so yeah, I mean, how do you think about these two sides of what cinema can do?
Yeah, so if you think about the way that a lot of psychoanalysts talk about orgasm, so orgasm, really the interest there is the leading up to, and it's called in French the little death, because in fact once you experience this sort of moment of jouissance, there's actually sort of a death in your desire latterly. So, and in a sense, I would argue that the films that really stand the test of time, yes, we can say that there are films that offer closure, this idea of oneness and alterity, that are enjoyable and funny and why not, but they're not really the ones that are stand the test of time and really are the greatest and really kind of echo down the ages and really speak to us. And I think it's not surprising that we're getting frustrated with cinema, with the Marvel cinematic universe, because we're not offered these films because of a worry in terms of a risk or a discomfort at the level of financiers, because it's actually a logic that fundamentally undermines capitalism. So these kinds of films that I argue for, film is very, very good. So there's two sort of basic things. Firstly, there's sort of a very universalist, in a certain sense, or collective, let's just say, way that we experience film and that film is made. Film is made by huge teams of people who input their own subjectivity and their own creativity into this sort of this collective, even though we are led by like a director. You know, we sit and often watch films in the dark with a mass of people in the cinema. Obviously, that's less and less, but there's a broadcast, a mass broadcast. There's a certain way in which this is an event that happens together. There's also things that, you know, the film is very bodily. There's lots of affect, you know, that this is something. Film also is taking often multiple language. We enjoy watching films that are from different countries. You know, when we, there's this idea, I remember hearing it about 15 years ago, but the reason why the Real Housewives shows are so full of arguing is that when we watch other people's faces, we infer their emotion by actually embodying the small movements of the muscles and the faces of the people we see. So that when we actually get Botox, we start to not be able to read each other, and this ends up escalating to a fight. So the point being is that when we watch films, this is something that transcends, you know, particular languages. It's a very bodily kind of experience. And as I say, it's to do with affect, but mainly film is very good at mobilizing desire. And this might be because of the contingent moment at which, in capitalism, at which film kind of took off, which is, you know, people always talked about like late capitalism. I don't know. How do we know? The owl of Minerva flies at dusk. We don't know if it's late. Maybe, you know, so perhaps when cinema developed was really early capitalism rather than mid capitalism. But, you know, there is this, Hollywood was coming about in the 20th century. And it's interesting that Slavoj's film, A Pervert's Guide to Cinema and A Pervert's Guide to Ideology, he talks about film as a perverse art because it points out where we lack and tells us how to desire. This is the logic of the advert under Don Draper. It's not enough to, in a utilitarian sense, to just sell an object to a consumer. Capitalism has to go further.
It's perverted in the sense that it knows better for you what's best for you than you yourself know. Is that it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
So this is to do with, you know, directing our desire. And I would actually argue that film is at its most emancipatory when it hystericizes us. So rather than like it is the ultimate pervert art, or whatever he says is the ultimate hysterics art, I would say. But anyway, so film is very good, you know, it deals with desire. We often have a lacking, or let's say a character who seems to be contingently lacking at the beginning of the story, and they go after, you know, fulfillment or whatever, and we're taking on this journey with them, and we invest in their loss that they hope to overcome through the story. So the basic argument is that just as people think that psychoanalysis, well, something that you often hear is a criticism of the patriarchal nature of psychoanalysis, that Freud was this great patriarch who, in this perverse sense, would have someone lying down in a weaker position relative to him, and he would point out what was wrong with them and tell them how to, which is absolutely the precise opposite. So we go into psychoanalysis with this transferential thrust towards the belief that this person is going to help us. And only through this performance of looking for the answer are we gradually let down in our desire to realize that the analyst is lacking just like us. And this liberates us in some way. So in a similar way, you can get sort of misdirected by the fact that cinema offers this promise of oneness and alterity as that's the problem with it. But actually, what it does is it mobilizes our desire. We are opened up. We buy right in, in the sense, I think I use this example that so many philosophers and theologians have used, that only a Christian can be an atheist. It's only when you go to the absolute heart of your desire that you're really let down. It's not enough to be a nun married to Jesus Christ. The actual radical thing is to really go for it, and you'll actually then be exposed to the failure of your desire. So that cinema, precisely because we invest in it, precisely because even if we know better, nevertheless, it's not just possible to reason your way out of the resultant desire structure of lack. We are imprinted with this. This is what makes life worth living, but it's also something that trips us up and causes us a lot of suffering and can lead us down the garden path in all sorts of ways, politically and economically. But we invest in the promise of oneness and alterity, or the closure. And we are so almost hypnotically drawn in, the same way as a patient in psychoanalysis is drawn into the belief that the analyst knows something. And at the end of the film, potentially the temple curtain rips, and we're in this position where we can be let down in our desire and confronted with its lack. And I think I point out some films that I think do it really well. For example, a well-known one is The Wizard of Oz. Another one is a more recent film called Pig with Nicolas Cage, which uses all of these signifiers that make you think you're watching a thriller, but it's actually something very philosophically interesting, including the casting of Nicolas Cage himself. These are all things that work on us to make us invest in the film in a certain way. I think I talk about a Belgian film, 2 Days, One Night, that I think does it really well. But yeah, there's lots of different examples in the
Could
book.
you just briefly explain how The Wizard of Oz? I think that's probably the most famous example you've got out of the three.
Absolutely.
Could you explain how it does that at the end?
Yeah, so basically, and this is kind of like a Hegelian logic as well, that it's only by dint of investing in the journey and going on this journey that these characters, Dorothy, the Tin Man, whatever, that they come to learn a truth about themselves because they have invested in this promise of this wizard, this all-knowing wizard. Then at the end of the film, they discover temple curtain rips. Behind the curtain is just a man with a voice organ, and it's nothing. But in actually engaging in this journey of desire towards an attempted fulfillment of knowledge about themselves, that they have actually learned about themselves, and then they are free to use that information in the light of a sort of death of God theological scenario.
So The Wizard of Oz is the way, if somebody wants to have a shortcut into the phenomenology of spirit, this is how you come to understand absolute knowing.
Exactly.
The end
it's the
of
ultimate
Wizard of
Hegelian
Oz.
movie. Yeah.
Because right,
It's
isn't that
crazy.
what absolute knowing's about? Where you when you get to the end of the phenomenology of spirit, it's not like some grand knowledge, some omniscient God knowledge is given. It's just the realization that the truth was the series of failures all along.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
that there's no escaping contradiction.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's great. Yeah, everybody now, when you read Phenomenology of Spirit, you got to read it alongside a watching of the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
So, Nance, I mean, you and I, we were having a conversation a couple days ago leading up to this, and you made a really fascinating point that I've been thinking about ever since, that I think you need to ask Helen about, because I really want to know what she thinks. You were talking about, well, what is the status nowadays of the cinematic subject based on what TikTok and all this stuff? So long, I think that's a great point.
I actually think it ties in right here too, because talking about like the Wizard of Oz and almost having to go on this like realistic hero's journey. So you're not the non-duper. I was thinking about Vince Vaughn. And this kind of like postmodern cynicism. And I think a lot of people get cynicism confused with actually going through this process of predication and failure to arrive at this kind of irresolvable contradiction. I think that's important. And I like the way you kind of handle like that, because I don't think it's good to fall into just gross cynicism. And I think the place where gross cynicism lives is social media. And like at my house with my family, we have movie like themed months or weeks or whatever. Like we're currently watching the Alien series, so we're watching it, you know, every couple nights after dinner we'll sit and watch. And it's very frustrating because my partner and my kids pull their phone out as soon as the movie comes on.
So do I.
Like, I wonder how or if maybe we could extrapolate a kind of emancipatory framework onto the new types of media that people are consuming, because I don't know if people have it in them to consume film anymore.
I know it is really sad, actually. And I picked a bad job because the industry is like totally collapsed, especially in the last couple of years. And actually, I've become massively more addicted to my phone in the last couple of years. So I don't think there's like a, you know, it's sort of one is maybe the result of the other. But let's just say that I think film offers a sort of concise circular logic of the good infinite, and the doom scroll is the bad infinite. You know, this itch that never gets scratched, and it just goes on and on and on and on. So it's the logic of addiction versus the logic of love. And I think that capitalism is basically this logic of addiction, and that absolute knowing, and I don't know what an economic way of structuring society based on the logic of absolute knowing would be called. Some have called it communism, some have called it all sorts of other, well, you know, that's a whole complicated signifier in and of itself. But yeah, this endless logic, and you kind of talk about a version of nihilism that is it's easy to fall into. And this is, I think, something that I was trying to get at in the book, and a very famous quote of Lacan that people talk about in various different ways is this: do not give way in terms of your desire. This apparently contradictory, this contradictory but perhaps meaningful in its contradiction statement around the structure of desire. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Lacan uses a word that relates to traffic, céder in French, which means to yield. So do not give way in terms of your desire. So give way is a word that can both mean to give yourself over, to yield to succumb to. And it also means in traffic, give way. So stop and let it pass, the other person pass. I don't know if they have that in America, but that's what it says. When you're supposed to stop and the other traffic has right of way, it's the yield sign in the UK. But this is, you know, he's basically, this dictum is telling you it's shit either way, whether you let your desire pass you by, like a sort of stoic conservative, or whether you go for it like a hyper indulgent, I don't know, utopian. Either way, you're fucked. But with this information, you have to still negotiate this terribly difficult and life-affirming thing called desire. Desire exists as long as you are a speaking subject. You're screwed by it, and it also makes your life meaningful. And whether you engage in it in a utopian sense, and it's funny because, you know, there are people who interpret Lacan, I would say, the more kind of like, let's say, progressive capitalist interpretation, which sits alongside a lot of, let's say, university discourse stuff, is this island of jouissance. You can have your cake and eat it. And then on the other side, maybe the more antique and, let's say, traditionally right-wing position is, you know, suck it up. Don't go there. It's not worth it. But actually, in reality, to be an adult, an emancipated adult with this knowledge it's not easy either way. And in fact, you know, understanding this in terms of how it affects everybody can maybe make us more empathetic and more, well, firstly, it does undermine the logic of capital, which would be mostly this sort of more utopic, positivist, you can be assuaged in your desire. So that sort of logic is undermined, but it's not so, it is not actually a solution to go the other way and kind of be reactionary about it. And this is the same thing with a lot of people kind of accuse lack first thinkers of being nihilists. Not at all. We would not have excess without lack. You literally cannot have light without dark, on without off, excess without lack. Lack is precisely what allows, it's like the slingshot of reality being pulled back so that something more can be experienced. So yeah, it's not an answer that, and I know a lot of people sometimes look to a kind of negative, well, like a positivist nihilism, where it's like the solution is don't get your hopes up, or you can find a solution to the dilemma of desire with which we're inflicted by being human can be solved by being a nihilist, or as you say, being what's the word, cynical. But I think this logic of this way of understanding the world actually leads us to understand where the depth dimension of life is, and we have to engage in it. And it is the gift and curse we are given as speaking subjects. And we have to tarry with it and negotiate it, but that's as good as it gets.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, yeah, it is a weird thing. I would just say that it does seem like social media at this point, though, because I feel like cinema does what you say it does, and it's almost like the constant bad infinity, as you say, of social media is really there to prevent us from actually having an encounter with lack via cinema. I call it the great eclipse, where your phone eclipses the TV screen.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is, this rate of attention is just accelerated when you put the phone in front of the phone screen in front of the TV screen. And I look back like, I get it. Like a lot of Lacanians will say, we got to fight against nostalgia, because nostalgia is this, reactionary thing. It's a false promise, but there's some sort of nostalgia. I go, no, like I actually think it was better.
Some things need to be better. Yeah.
Yes. Something.
Not everything, but some things. Yeah.
The way I could watch a movie, like I being born in 82 and growing up in that media landscape, it was funny. They were so worried about video games destroying our ability to focus and concentrate. And I had like incredible I could just lose myself in a movie. It was all that existed.
Yeah.
And now I deal with the same thing Nance is talking about, where, I'll hear a message or something, then I'm putting the phone in front of the TV screen, checking it. And yet it's funny. There's still movies that if I put them on, they do have the power to eclipse the phone.
Yeah,
and I think those movies are incredibly special now.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like it has to be a work of art. I was watching Zone of Interest a few months ago and was completely captivated, and it worked on me. But I'm a total phone addict. I have terrible attention span now. I used to, as a teenager, watch like 5 movies a day, and now I feel like the accomplishment of reading a book if I complete a movie. It's terrible. I mean, it's like. But just to go back to this anti-nostalgia thing, like absolutely, when nostalgia is an ideological, let's say, reactionary protection mechanism against the disappointment of the present, but there is such thing as discerning something that's productive and something that's not, and sometimes there are moments where things, and also it is not wrong that capitalism, the logic of the market, is expanding into every crevasse of our being. So at certain points where there was less commodity logic operating on various aspects of our lives, it was potentially more possible. And it just so happens that time functions in a certain way, I don't think it's reactionary to say that, but like, it's still possible. And the thing is, it's because of contradiction. This is where I may be, like, despite myself, quite optimistic. Anything can happen, Things can be completely blindsided by contradiction. So we can predict where things are going. We can, imagine how bad things are going to get or whatever. But there is always a possibility. There is always an opening, just as Lacan says that there is a latent hysteria in all subjects in the world. So there is this sort of, I sometimes find some Lacanians like turning to subjective structures like a horoscope, like I'm this person, I was, you know, born through language into this position and there's nothing I can do. It's like, no, the fact that you can speak actually shows that there is this ability to stand outside of yourself, which hysteria is basically this position of coming to see yourself as divided, that is possible for everybody. So yeah, it's always possible. But there's also, I think where this anti-nostalgia question comes in is that it's not possible to turn back time, you know, which is obviously the problem with a lot of these, let's say, populist right positions that are coming about, that often come about because of the nature of capitalism. Pandora's box has already been opened. You know, there's no going back on the future. So we have to constantly rethink reality in light of what is manifest in it, in this sort of ever-changing landscape.
The core insight, which is like, being nostalgic for something that was actually better makes sense, and maybe it can inform the future in some way, but you can't go back. And so a lot of the trad life shit, I'm just like, I mean, Baudrillard would just go, this is simulation of a former time. You're not actually in the former time. You can't bring it back. All you can do is simulate it. And so, you know, it's always a copy of a copy of a copy. But
Exactly.
but no, so in your book, I feel like and maybe there's a fourth one, a fifth one. I feel like there's three key binary distinctions that are kind of your theoretical matrix. And so I think these help to really kind of lay out the theoretical consistency at work in it, which is you have opposition versus contradiction.
Yeah.
You have particularity versus universality, and you have capital versus cinema at its best. So could you kind of explain how these three kind of click together?
Yes. So I would say that these three, the one that you put first is the reactionary position against the anxiety raised by the possibility in the second position. So basically, contradiction is this, you know, we have these brilliant thinkers like Freud, like Hegel, like the Apostle Paul, who have confronted contradiction in different ways and theorized it and sort of symbolized it in a way that maybe is digestible and understandable and useful to us, because there is a truth in it. So I'm very pro-truth. I know a lot of sort of postmoderns, there's no such thing as truth, there's only ideology. I think there's plenty of ideology, and we can, let's say, unknit that to expose certain truths. And truths can present themselves to us in certain ways at certain times, and we can come at different moments in history and understand the truth in a different way. But this underlying logic of contradiction helps us understand the world in which we live with greater clarity. But it also comes with this residual anxiety, because when you grasp this truth, it leads somewhere we don't want to go, which is the nature of the universe itself, our position in the universe, our longevity as singular subjects, the death of God. And I would say that capitalism constantly, in order to extract profit, it has to have this binary problem solution logic. As you say, the promise to assuage lack. So it has to train us out of the truth philosophy of contradiction and constantly make us feel like there is this possibility that lack isn't ontological, it's contingent. And we were talking before we pressed record about court cases being brought into nuisance suing, and how, as subjects, even though the law attempts to offer fairness, whether it can or can't is another question. But we always, and I'm totally guilty of this, when we see things happening, even though, you know, one of the great discoveries of history is this idea of, or but let's say technology of history is innocent until proven guilty, because it offers this possibility of contradiction, that we might be wrong, we might be thinking ideologically when the truth is actually different. But as soon as, I mean, I find this, there's a court case going on, like, oh, no smoke without fire, you know, there must be something to it. We think ideologically all the time, and it becomes more and more difficult to think in this contradictory way because of the pressures of the economic forces of the way we structure society. Today, one of the issues is this particularism through identity politics. And it's very, Lacan talks about in 1969, he talks about the four discourses in his sort of response to what he sees as the failures in 1968. And one of these discourses is the university discourse. And it exploits, let's say, potentially philosophical developments that may have arisen through an analytic perspective and neuters them in service of capital, basically, and uses the aesthetic of knowledge, of progress, of right thinking. And this is also a logic that's delineated, and you mentioned the non-duped, that we take an idea and abstract it from its actual meaning and usefulness and run with it, and then in doing so mystify our sort of, in a sense, psychotic capitalistic logic. So identity politics is really prevalent today because of the way in which it is now necessary to farm profit out of subjectivity itself, commodity logic. And this is where social media comes in. Social media is the privatization of human interaction. Even though these forces are ultimately extremely destructive, they are more comforting in the short term because they promise it's possible to assuage our haunting by lack, which, if you take a couple, not very many logical steps from, exposes the fact that we emerge from less than nothing rather than, even if we're atheists, we sort of believe this, some all-knowing being who kind of makes it okay, / a sort of unconscious belief that we can live forever. When really we have like 80 good years, potentially if we're lucky. We come from not even death, but less than death. And we're all alone.
Yeah.
And it's really not, and the thing is, as Hegel points out, like there's this moment of absolute knowing can come up at any point in history. Like we're offered it at all times because contradiction is present. And as we, let's say, derive more understanding about our world, we often have to do more repression of contradiction as that contradiction is exposed. But really, it's anxiety producing, because you don't have to extrapolate very far where this leads. And who wants to admit that? Who wants to admit you're literally, you know, my parents are 70, 71. Who wants to admit that?
Mm-hmm.
Life is very, very finite. Who wants to admit that there's no transcendence other than lack?
Mm-hmm. No, it's difficult to deal with it. And so, I mean, you know, this divide, like you say, so cinema gives us opportunities to confront this, to reckon with it. Capitalism doesn't want us to do that, because if we did that, we would realize no commodity is ever going to satisfy us. This system is not going to give us happiness with a capital H. And so what does it do when things get tough? It wants to divide us or along lines of gender, race lines. And so it creates oppositions and tells us, hey, these people you're against, you could be complete. You could have happiness in the capitalist system if it wasn't for these people who just keep getting in the way.
Yeah.
And what that opposition does on a particular level, because this opposition is rooted in particularity, because it's us against them, identity against identity, is it obfuscates the universal lack in all of us that cuts across race, cuts across gender, and would actually allow human beings to get on the same page. Well, system doesn't want that, so ensure that everything is identity oriented, particularity oriented, and when things get tough, don't let people see the opposition within, which would be contradiction. Let them externalize it in the form of an antagonism with another group. And I don't know, that's kind of how I see those three binaries working in the book.
Yeah, so it's interesting as well how a sort of very badly understood version of critical theory has lubricated this logic, has cast. So one of the interesting statements that Marx makes constantly in the Communist Manifesto is to not fall into the logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Two things can also be bad. But we're so used to thinking oppositionally that it's really, really difficult. But also in offering a discourse that justifies and seems to, in a scientific or intellectualized way, explicate our gut feeling towards essential differences that actually is not real. And in fact, race is potentially an invention of capital. So, but it's interesting, we live in this moment where everybody calls everybody a fascist. So, and I of course, the gut thing is I want to say, like, this is stupid, calling people, and I think it's very tactically stupid to call everybody a Nazi. Of course, Nazism is a version of this sort of fascism that came out of Middle Europe at a very specific time, very specific year, 1930s, Middle Europe, in very specific conditions. But what I will say is that, and it's not just a problem of capitalism. Capitalism is the most recent and the most repressed and present version of an attempt to manage the contradiction that has occurred throughout human history. But humans, in light of lack, have a tendency that is the tendency in fascism to create necessary enemies to sustain a utopic logic. So utopias are impossible, as the name suggests. The utopia of oneness and alterity where our lack can be assuaged. It isn't possible. It is only possible in fantasy, but in order to sustain the fantasy, this is the same logic of self-sabotage that is discussed quite a lot in psychoanalysis. You have to have an enemy behind whom you can imagine this perfect world exists. And the more difficult and the more proximate to an understand, so the more difficult reality, the more often, we have this returned repressed of contradiction, and the more we want to fight it. And we require enemies to sustain. The gift the enemy gives you is a present fantasy that can assuage a confrontation with a lack in reality that's becoming more and more visible. And that is the destructive logic of fascism that marked the Nazis' logic. Obviously, the enemy was the Jew. So it is something that humans have a tendency to fall into.
That's really good. Nance, what she just said, talking about fantasy and self-sabotage, got me thinking about a question you were thinking about along the lines of what's the relation between fantasy and death drive. I think you should touch on that. That's good.
Yeah. So I've been reading a lot of Attai, and I always do, and also thinking superego. Mikey and I have been doing a lot with superego recently, and so I'm just kind of like, I guess, rethinking drive.
Yeah.
And there's a part in the book where, to me, reading it, I was like, that sounds a bit weird, and it sounded like you said, well, let me pull it up and I'm at, let me see. So death drive is the attempt by the subject to eradicate the dialectic by returning to a oneness that is not even possible in death. And that sounds like it got me questioning the nature of drive, desire, and fantasy, and like, where do these all fit? Because I guess trying to come up with a more Bataillean version of drive that is kind of predicated on discontinuity. And like an ethical encounter, rather than one that this sounds more fantasy and desire. And I guess I'm just kind of like, where do they fit together?
Yeah, so that sentence is to do with this idea that people can conceive of death. It's interesting because first of all, there's this question of death drive, life drive. Some people feel like death drive is more of the foundational force of the human subject than life. Therefore, we are going to go towards sort of cataclysm. Some people think that, yes, that death drive exists, but fundamentally, there's also this instinctual desire to make it. So maybe, so there's life drive and death drive in that sense. But there's also this question of, does death drive really mean death? What does death mean? What are the conditions of death? And also, if it is a death drive of a death understood in a certain way, does it sustain life? That sounds like total nonsense. But anyway, so the real idea is that death is not the end. There's I think, who was it? There's a philosopher who talks about, what happens when you die? Will you become the matter and the atoms that feed the dirt, that grow the flowers, that grow the food that's eaten by the animals? So you're the carbon atoms that keep existing. So there's no like, there is a life beyond death. It's other people. But it's this idea, this Hegelian idea, that death is divided in and of itself. There's no, okay, so for instance, there is this idea that you would want to return to the womb tomb, as in, there was a moment before birth where we imagine that we've lost this oceanic oneness with our mother, but that was never a singular experience without contradiction and lack. We were in our mother's bodies, which are divided, which exist because of division. And if you go all the way back in the phenomenology of spirit, he's talking about contradiction at the level of the signifier resulting through subjectivity. Subjectivity is the result of the signifier. Subjectivity is lacking. The signifier can never capture reality without lack. The atom itself is divided. Every atom, I'm not a scientist, so don't at me, but in my basic understanding, we have like GCSE in the UK, which is like a lower level to SAT, I guess. But I remember doing chemistry, there's always a missing electron. Well, it depends. Sometimes there's 8 electrons in it. Anyway, whatever. When there's a missing electron, this is the logic of metonymy of the signifier as well. But this lack leads to an adherence to a new atom and creating these chains of whatever. So death is like, there is no moment in our world that's not contradictory. And this is why people have to end up creating fantasies of different universes and what happens after death and all this kind of stuff, this excess. Because there is actually, in a sense, no death. Because we just are part of this return in contradiction. So death drive, right? Okay, let's think about somebody. I'll talk about myself. I actually was giving Alfie and I doing this course on the symptom, and we did it in Belfast last week, and we're going to do it in everyday analysis. But I sort of often feel bad about like getting participants to like tell everybody else their symptom, but like I always use myself as an example. But I really realized something about myself, like just how much of a self-sabotage I am when I talked about this situation I was in. But basically what death drive does is it gives the self-sabotager the gift of renewed desire. So when you, okay, let's say you have a fantasy where you want to be a really successful athlete. And you are involved in a fantasy at the level of like, it's literally your symptom, you know, you have this fantasy that if only I get a gold medal, then I'll be whole and complete. One of the statistics is some of the most depressed people are the people who've just competed in Olympic Games. There's huge levels of suicide, etc., because you do it and you realize, is that it? What self-sabotage done? There was this British Olympic athlete in speed skating. Have you ever seen speed skating? The Winter Olympics. Yeah,
Yeah, they
with
wear the
these like
funniest
silly outfits. It's like a
helmets
Malcolm in the Middle skate. Yeah, exactly.
the oddly phallic helmets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sperm-like.
Yeah.
So basically, she was like the world record holder, world champion, whatever. But every time she came to the Olympics, every single race, she would fall over in some way. You know, it's an accidents-prone sport, but this was like crazy. You know, there were X number of rounds and she'd always crash out and she never got a medal, despite being one of the greatest athletes of all time. But what this does is it offers the subject its death drive, as in it's towards your fantasy is aiming towards closure, as in I can get a gold medal and it will make me whole and complete, which is a drive towards death, as in what we imagine death is, which is a return to the oceanic oneness, a possible world before the contradiction of subjectivity, which is contingent. The thing is, like, subjects exist because of the ontological nature of lack in the universe. So the drive towards death that exists in fantasy allows fantasy to exist because it's a drive towards failure. But failure sustains it's funny, I don't know if you've noticed, like there's this real fetishism of failure right now, this like we're so human, we're the same, you know, with these podcasts where all these famous CEOs like say all the 5 times in their life where they failed, and you're like, well done, this is a better person than me, you know.
It's
But
shittification.
it's
That's ideology to get us happy with shittier everything. It's getting worse.
Yeah, that's probably true, actually. That is actually probably true.
Yeah.
You know, some things are better than others. This is like the nostalgia thing. So when people are like, oh, there's no such thing as whatever, it's like, there is actually. Some things are good. Yeah, that probably wasn't a very good explanation. But it's just basically what I wanted to reinforce in that sentence was it's not just enough to say death is the end, or and I think that's kind of a mistake with some theories that have emerged on the right to deal with some of the issues, to try to explicate where we are and where we're going. I'm not that familiar with like accelerationism and stuff like this, but death doesn't provide that either. Like the end doesn't provide that either. Like the end is the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, like Nick Land had death drive in his philosophy early on. He doesn't really talk about it anymore, but for him, it was this movement towards annihilation in the strict sense. Whereas for us, what's unique about death drive is it's really an immortality drive. And this whole thing with jouissance is what we're actually in pursuit of is this kind of moment of eternal death, where it's this heightened sensation to the point that it destroys your subjectivity while you're still existing in some zombie-like state. And that's why Slavoj always uses the zombie as this, you know, this personification of the drive. So it's not annihilation. It's not non-existence in the strictest term. So in a weird way, we could, if we wanted to rhetorically play with it, we could say death drive is the life drive at its most stubborn. But it's the problem with that is when we think of life, or we use the term, we view it more in terms of homeostasis, pleasure principle. Life is about, you know, balance and not having too much excess. And so it's always tricky. because when I try to explain death drive, that's how people interpret it. They think it's a drive towards actual demise, the end of your biological existence. And it's like, nah, that's not what drive is doing for Lacan and Zizek.
No.
And yeah, it's this
Well,
movement towards this
that's why
immortality.
I think the discontinuity thing for me is like is really good, because like, yeah, you like being a discontinuous being, we do continue to live on in others, and in fact, like having this kind of ethical encounter with the other allows you to be the subject yourself, and to continue to go on, and like waves in a pond and blah blah blah.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is just to like reiterate in terms of there was something both of you said that I actually can't remember. It's funny because my baby's next door, and the poor guys are getting hungry. So as soon as is the maternal kind of like but he's hungry. So we talk about death drive. Oh yes, this immortality, right? So immortality being this utopic logic. It's not possible to be immortal. It's not possible to exist without death. So this drive towards the immortal is a drive towards an impossibility, but this drive towards impossibility actually allows for certain things to actually be made possible. As in, life is worth living only because of the excesses of desire, drive, fantasy. Mm-hmm. So these are not things to eradicate; they're things to tarry with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Helen, I think we this has been great. We kind of did a good intro to your book. There's a lot more we want to talk to you about in the future, but we'll come back for another conversation. I want to talk to you about gaze. Yeah.
Oh my
we'll
gosh.
do a part 2.
Gaze. I mean, this is like my pet peeve. And actually, I didn't listen to Y Theory the other day, but somebody said that they did a podcast on gaze. So I'm excited to listen to that, because I think it's the most misunderstood. Well, only because I'm coming from like a film background, and in film theory, it's just great. You cannot exaggerate how this nonsense term version of this term has come to sort of dominate perspectives. And I think understanding the difference between the film studies understanding of gaze, which sort of developed via this essay that kind of went viral in the 70s, and actual Lacanian gaze, I think is also one of these examples where you can kind of understand the difference between a emancipatory logic outside of capital and capitalist university discourse. So maybe we'll save that for the next time.
Yeah, but like I say, for me, gaze was one of the most difficult concepts in Lacan to wrap my head around, but it's, I feel like I have an understanding of it thanks in large part and primarily to you and Todd McGowan. I think you two are the best at talking about it. So yeah, we definitely would like to talk to you about that. And so yeah, we'll do this again sometime.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, because I really enjoyed talking to you, and thanks for reading the book. I'm always, it's
great.
like
we love it.
Such a nice gift to like have a conversation with someone about ideas that you're interested in.
Heck yeah.
I love it. Well, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And everybody go check out Philosophy Portal. Check out the course that Helen and Alfie are teaching next month. Sign up, and it'll be a blast. I guarantee it. So awesome. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.